Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Schultz. I'm the Executive Director of Research here at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And I want to welcome you this afternoon to a very important discussion about immigration, key to the future policies and practices. This discussion today has come out of this book recently published by the New York State Bar Association with Albany Law School and the Rockefeller Institute of Government. For this discussion today, we've invited Scott Fein to bring together some of the authors of the chapter of this important work. Scott is a senior advisor for the Center of Law and Policy Solutions here at the Rockefeller Institute. He has a very accomplished career. Among things that he has done is served as chair of the State Bar Association's annual program in Albany on ethics and civility. He is chair of the Government Law Center Board of Advisors at Albany Law School. And he was honored for his service to his profession when he was the statewide recipient of the 2021 New York State Bar Association's Award for Pro Bono Service. He has contributed to and edited numerous publications about state government, including Making of a Modern Constitution, the prospects for constitutional reform in New York State, protections in New York State constitutions beyond the Federal Bill of Rights, rural justice in New York State, challenges and recommendations, and New York, a laboratory for innovative public policy. So we welcome him today and all of our speakers to talk about immigration, key to the future, the benefits of resettlement of upstate New York. Scott?
Hi. Well, thank you so much, Laura. Notwithstanding what I've done in the past, I think this topic is certainly among the most important. And so I thank the Rockefeller Institute for giving me the opportunity and all of us the opportunity to address it. As Laura mentioned, today's webinar will focus on matters pertaining to the resettlement of immigrants, and in particular, refugees in upstate New York, with particular emphasis on their impact in upstate New York. Now, what was the and I'll try to make this as quick because the contributors are more important than I. What was the impetus for the webinar? Well, it was a project that was begun by Rockefeller Institute, the Government Law Center, and Albany Law School, and the State Bar about 2 years ago to evaluate the impact of resettlement on upstate New York, resettlement of refugees and immigrants. Now, you might say, why did we choose this topic? Frankly, it was to explore a perceived anomaly. As you may know, refugees are a subset of migrants who seek asylum in the U.S. Because of well-founded fears of persecution for a variety of reasons. The federal government decides where refugees, once admitted, shall resettle in conjunction with a variety of not-for-profit agencies. And this is, I think this is the essence of it. Since 2000, more than 6%, federal government has decided more than 6% of refugees that enter into the U.S., resettled in the U.S., should be resettled in New York State. Now that places us slightly behind California and Arizona. And of that number, of the 6%, 90% are resettled in upstate New York. So to date, more than 60,000 refugees have been resettled in upstate New York. What is the perceived anomaly that we wish to inquire into? Well, skeptics said, how could you parachute refugees from foreign lands into upstate New York, 60,000 refugees into upstate New York? We're more homogeneous in upstate New York, we're less populated, and some would say, though I don't think all of us would agree, even more conservative. These were the skeptics who said it simply won't work. We decided 2 years ago to evaluate how it has worked out. And toward that end, we asked 30 experts, demographers, statisticians among them, to determine what the impact of these refugees have been on the communities. The product of their effort the 30 contributors, if you will, has been embodied in a recently published book, as Laura mentioned, Immigration: Key to the Future. As you may have gleaned from the title, Key to the Future, the impact determined by our contributors was quite positive, offsetting dwindling populations upstate, enhancing economies, adding to the multicultural richness of the community, so much so that a number of the localities are seeking additional refugees to resettle. Today, we've asked, as Laura pointed out, 4 of our contributors to offer their perspectives. We will begin with Laura González-Murphy. Laura is a director of immigration policy and research at the New York State Department of State. Dr. Murphy is a policy advisor in the state's development response to immigration policy, in particular, how we deal with federal immigration policy. She will provide an overview of the state's programs and initiatives. Laura?
Thank you, and sorry, everybody, we've had some issues with background noise that I've been trying to avoid, but thank you, Scott. I am Laura González-Murphy, Director of Immigration Policy and Research, as we said, at the Department of State. I also want to thank Laura, the Bar Association, Rockefeller Institute of Government, and Albany Law School for the opportunity to contribute to one of what I consider, I think, pretty much the first comprehensive evaluation of upstate New York's immigration trends in that book referred to earlier. And also for the invite to discuss New York's policy here with everyone today. I want to say thank you on behalf of the co-authors as well, because it wasn't just me for that chapter, but Camila Campisi and Jenny Munoz. So, like mentioned earlier by Scott, for more than a century, the movement of people across national borders in the United States has been the exclusive domain of the federal government. Not always that way, but for at least a century. And the role of the federal government in immigration has expression in the nation's legal system and its enforcement mechanism, like we all know, specifically the Immigration and Nationality Act that we know as INA. However, over the last 2 decades or so, recognizing the important role that immigrants play in the economic, culture, social fabric of the local communities they reside in, cities and states have increasingly allocated resources for the implementation of programs, policies that facilitate the incorporation and acculturation of immigrants to life into their new chosen home. I kind of like the way that Audrey Singer and Andrew Weiner of the Brookings Institute mentioned this role, and they quote, "Cities and states have become the new immigration policy innovators." Along this line, New York State has found very innovative ways to support immigrants and their communities within that framework that we mentioned of the federal government retaining the exclusive power to determine an individual's immigration status, practical consequences of that status, etc. Many academics and policymakers refer to this devolution process as new federalism. But for the purposes of New York State's unique evolution from creating a set of pathways of inclusion like language access, civic education, etc., to its most recent innovator role, focused on a mission to keep immigrant families and communities together. Through a holistic understanding of needs and by mitigating the punitive effects of being unauthorized under federal rules, for example. The chapter that we wrote in Immigration: Key to the Future outlines New York State's role as immigrant policymaking, while the federal government is one we see as immigration policymaking. Because it can be confusing, so this kind of sets for us a clarification as to our role. So in New York State, the increasingly important dimension of immigrant policymaking has found expression in a variety of state-issued policies, programs across time and space, including the refugee program that is regulated by the federal government. But these policies have culminated in a way that is still evolving with the creation of the Office for New Americans in the late 2012. Before explaining a little bit about this office, I want to share a couple of examples of that policies that led to that culmination. There's many, but just some key. Back in 1980, for example, state agencies worked together through the creation of an interagency coordinating committee that would address issues of farm workers in upstate New York, their rights, making sure that they had an advocacy level at the governor's level. In 2001, the state created the Outreach Office to Ethnic Communities, And this was in response to many of our lawyers present today will be aware of the expiration of a 2001 federal program known as the 245 adjustment, through which certain immigrants could pay a fee and not have to go abroad to process their applications and stay together. When that terminated, the state responded with outreach support, trying to see how we can help. And that was Outreach Office of Ethnic Communities. I think one of the most important examples of how the state was becoming engaged, though, took place in 2011 with the suspension of New York's participation in Homeland Security Secure Communities. That was 2011. This program designated it was designated to identify immigrants in U.S. prisons who were considered deportable. It created a lot of fear in the community, so New York State pulled out. With this suspension, New York State took its first step in immigration enforcement determination, informing the federal government of its intention to prioritize the rights of its residents, the human rights, and upholding that, the policy was counter to that. In 2011 as well, the state issued an Executive Order 26, directing state agencies to provide direct public services to for language assistance, so translation and interpretation, to people with limited English proficiency. I'm the language access coordinator as well as Department of State. That very executive order has also evolved, but in signing this order, the state recognized that there are millions of New Yorkers with limited ability to speak, read, write, or understand English. And even though they may be eligible for certain services, they still can't access them. So I think that those were key issues in the history of New York State that set the stage for the creation in 2012 of New York State's, and actually the country's first of its kind Office for New Americans. This office was codified later as in statutorily as well in 2015, and it also became the first of its kind. The mission has, ONUS really has a unique status, and that status is a testament to our commitment to immigrant families and the communities where they reside. So immigrants and refugees, because the office where I sit and where I work really is a response to that, to all immigrants across the state. Our mission is to provide them with the tools to participate in the economic and overall well-being of their community, irrespective of their status and often irrespective of what's happening at the federal level. I was a professor during the time that the concept paper to create this office was issued, and it really asked the community, how should we help New Americans? That to me, while I remember being in the classroom reviewing the concept paper, was amazing. My background was on the relationship between civil society, so the community, and state government in different countries. I thought it was wonderful to be able to consult before you create, before you change, to consult the community. So I wanted to be part of it, and fortunately I am. So how do we implement those services? It's really through grants with community-based organizations who we recognize, again, as I said, what caught my attention, but that the communities know best. So at this point, I should know that ONA has also gone through its own evolution. In 2012, we focused on what we like to call 3 pillars, naturalization, ESOL, and some workforce development. It was kind of happy times. However, in 2017, with the awareness of the importance of understanding that immigration does not happen on a vacuum, but responds to a host of national, international, cultural, sociological factors, ONA's programming started changing. And it now has an extensive and comprehensive array of services, from legal assistance under universal representation, meaning all types of issues are considered, not just naturalization, workforce development, still preparing new Americans for naturalization, providing English language, etc. We run a hotline. There's a whole host of programs all aimed at making and allowing an individual to feel at home and be able to be successful and contribute to their community. We also do this and work in the defense of our communities by responding to immediate needs impacting new Americans, including the refugee flows today. We are not part of that refugee program from the federal government, but we support. Our programs support like Afghans with workforce development, identifying employment, recredentialing. But we're also working under this bucket of immediate needs with a program providing relief to new Americans impacted by Hurricane Ida. So we do that as well. We collaborate with the governor's office and other state agencies in responding to federal immigration policy and respond by submitting comments and recommendations to proposed rulings. Also, ONA is a member of various national and state organizations. Particularly, we're very proud to say that we're founding members of the National ONA Network. Back in 2015, the network started with 4 states, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, and later in 2015, California enacted legislation to create a statewide director of immigrant integration. These offices vary, but we communicate often and as issues happen. Right now with the refugee situation, we're in constant communication to see how states are addressing their flows and how they're best providing welcoming tools. Today, we have 13 agencies and hoping for more. So in conclusion, I should say that strengthening the well-being of New York State as a whole has led state government officials and policymakers to understand that facilitating an immigrant's participation in their local community needs to take a comprehensive approach. We need to look at the individual holistically. This approach focuses strategically on the particular circumstances of needs of that community, of that individual, but ultimately incorporates and leads to the stability of our families and our community. So with this perspective, New York State has engaged in operationalizing what I mentioned at the beginning, immigrant policy, by focusing on the provision of targeted participatory and integration services at the very local level. Happy to answer any questions later, but thank you again for the opportunity to share about our office and the process to be able to be a welcoming state and upstate New York too.
Laura, thank you so much. We will be saving questions for the end if there's consensus. And please submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A function found in your Zoom task bar. I hope you can find the Zoom task bar. Our next speaker is David Kallick, and David is the director of the Immigration Research Initiative. David is and I say this not to flatter him, but he's sort of the go-to person on a number of issues pertaining to immigrants and the like in New York State and well beyond. He has served as a central resource for analytical support on immigration issues to the State Priorities Partnership, a network of 42 state-based research groups, and has a significant familiarity with the issue. David?
Thanks, Scott. Maybe I'll start with, before you were asking the question, is it surprising? Why is it that we see this economic benefit for refugees and immigrants and also for the communities where they come? And I would say, if you listen to the national debates, especially if you're driving around listening to talk radio, that might seem like a very surprising thing. But if you think about what the challenges are in upstate New York, I think it's not surprising at all. I mean, let's start with what would be the most obvious challenge I think that any economic development official would tell you is facing upstate is the population decline in urban areas and in rural areas. And some years ago, the Federal Reserve in Buffalo wrote a report that had a great title. It was called Brain Drain or Lack of Brain Gain. And the point of the report was to say, the problems for upstate is not that people are moving out in particularly high numbers. You hear that often, it's the weather, people don't like to. People actually leave upstate New York in about the same numbers as they leave other places in the country proportionately. What's missing is people moving in, right? So the reason the population is declining is because people are not moving in the same numbers as they do in other places. So who moves in? Well, refugees, as you said, are placed and in fact have found a home. And I'm sure Shelly and others will talk about the way that works on the ground. But when refugees come to upstate New York, I doubt very much that many people are sitting in Somalia or Burma and thinking, I really want to come to Utica. Sorry, Shelly. But I think once they come, they see what a great place it is and how much there's an infrastructure and a way for them to fit in, right? I think that's true for immigrants in general. There are proportionately fewer immigrants in upstate New York than in other parts of the state and in other parts and actually quite below the national average as well. if immigrants moved into upstate at the same rate as they do to the US in general, you would actually turn around the population decline in all of the major areas of upstate New York. So it seems to me like we could spend a lot more energy embracing diversity. And I'm sure others in the webinar will talk about exactly the kinds of things we can do. We've done also in New York, I mean, in some ways, of course, we've done more than many places, and yet there's so much more that could happen. And I would love to see us invest in that kind of focus on diversity in a way as if it really mattered to not just to our sense of human rights, although that's also important, but to what our state's future is going to be. The economic development, investments could be justifying, I think, a much larger level of support than we currently get. In my paper, I talk about a bunch of different things. Maybe I'll focus a little bit on the idea of place-based economic development and then just touch on some of the other areas. So the idea of place-based economic development is, rather than trying to attract one big company, sometimes people call it smokestack chasing, right? But how do you, there's often economic development policies try to say, let's get some big industry that's going to employ lots of people. And I think that what makes a lot more sense is to think about how do we work from the ground up. And economists will often say it's easier to pull on a string than it is to push on a string. How do we see where there's already something happening and to foster more of that? So immigrants are very well known for entrepreneurship. And in particular, immigrants are especially likely to be Main Street business owners. So we did a big report looking at this and defined Main Street business owners as people owning restaurants and grocery stores and clothes stores and shops and beauty salons, the kinds of things that give a downtown area its character, and also that draw people to the downtown area instead of the big box stores on the outlying areas. So you have a little bit more street life in downtown. In Buffalo, for example, in the Buffalo metro area, immigrants make up 6% of the labor force, but then they're 9% of business owners, so they're disproportionately likely to be business owners, but there's 16% of Main Street business owners. So these are not the kinds of businesses that economic development policies usually focus on, but they're the bread and butter of economic revitalization. And I think they're what give, you can measure the benefits, not just in the jobs created or the tax revenues, although those are there too, but also in the neighborhood change. But in a lot of areas where you see boarded up storefronts or abandoned houses or things, whole areas that are lacking in economic vitality can be spurred to further growth by immigrants coming in and also other people coming in, right? So often what you see is an immigrant group comes in, opens maybe a restaurant that makes it more attractive for people from their ethnic group maybe to come, but also serves a wider community and makes the area feel like a nicer place to be. You see maybe there's a store that opens next door to that. Maybe people start to feel like it's an area that they want to live in again. And that's something that is not just about bringing immigrants to the area, but it's about creating a more diverse, welcoming place for everyone. There are, I think, all kinds of smart ways that we can think about how to support small business growth. Community development finance institutions have an important role to play. I think changing the way that banks assess risks is really important. A lot of what happens with banks right now, sorry if you can hear the siren coming by, a lot of what a lot of the challenge with the way that for immigrants to get loans from business for expanding small businesses is that their credit record doesn't look the way a bank wants it to look when they first look at it. But there are all kinds of ways that you can see how likely is a person to be able to repay a loan that goes beyond the credit record. And I will say, especially after the recession of 2008, I'm very conscious of the idea that we don't want banks to be lending money to people who can't pay it back. That's not going to be good for the people getting the loans any more than it is for the banks themselves. But I think that we can be a lot smarter in thinking about how do we assess what the risks are and make it so that more people can get loans. And so I can, if anybody wants to know the details, I can talk about that. But I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of investing in loan officers. So it's not really about changing the conditions of the loan. It's more about figuring out how do loan officers have the time, as well as the cultural competency and ways of thinking about how do they, how can they make better loans. Syracuse is really interesting in this regard. I mean, the Center State CEO and Upstart Syracuse are part of this Build From Within Alliance, which is happening around the country, well, in multiple cities around the country, and has been doing, I think, really interesting work to help immigrants and also people of color and people excluded from a lot of small business development in general to be part of a revitalization of both the North Side and the South Side. I'm not sure if Shelly's going to talk about this, but Utica is an interesting example as well, in the way that the center has been part of the downtown revitalization in Utica. And then I would say, paired with the small business development, encouraging home ownership is something that really makes a lot of sense. And again, you don't want people to buy a home if they can't afford it, but lots of people, in fact, can afford a home. And we did a study with Global Detroit to look at just how many people, in fact, are very well positioned to buy a home, but are excluded by the kinds of policies that prevent them from getting them, as well as from the fact that in some upstate cities, it's just not worth it for the banks, for the big banks, to make loans at the level of what a house would cost. So there are all kinds of ways that I think public investments could help to shape or change that. And what a benefit that would be to the upstate region if more people owned their homes and rehabbed them rather than renting. Refugee resettlement can be really critical. I mean, I think that upstate has a huge tradition of refugee resettlement, and there are all kinds of ways in which refugee resettlement agencies can help immigrants and refugees to make the kinds of progress in their own lives and for their communities. That's exactly what we would love to see. We were a part of helping form and advocate for the New York State Enhanced Services to Refugees program, which was the first of its kind state investment in refugee resettlement agencies to make sure that refugees were helped not just for the first 90 days, which is often the amount of services that they can get. If you can imagine being here for 90 days and being expected to be up and running, it's having come from some of the most horrific situations in the world. That's clearly not enough. And there are all kinds of ways that we all benefit by having people get the aid for longer. I'm a huge fan of libraries. I think libraries can be a great thing for immigrant integration and also, of course, for the rest of the community. I think English classes are in some ways the most, I can never quite understand why we wouldn't want to invest double, triple, quadruple the amount that we do in English classes for anybody who wants to take them. It's an obvious benefit to them. It's an obvious benefit to the economy for all of us. And it's also would counter one of the big objections you often hear about immigrants not speaking English. Why wouldn't we want to make it as easy as possible? And yet, I'm sure you know, there's a huge lack of quality English classes for people. Employers have a role. Enforcing labor law can be really important to make sure people actually have decent living standards. In rural areas, I think it's important to see how can we restore some of the funding that's been cut from places like the 4-H clubs and the YMCAs that can be places for skills development. And how do you make people feel like there's an exciting future, both for the immigrants who have come there and also for native-born people who are there? And maybe I'll just end with talking about farm areas where immigrants are also, the huge majority of farm laborers are immigrants. And immigrants are critical to New York's upstate farm and downstate farm economy. How do we make sure that they get treated like other workers and can have decent wages and be contributors to their communities? But also, how can immigrants become farm owners? Many of them are interested and have a history, come from backgrounds of farming, and are overlooked when people are thinking about succession plans or opportunities for developing farm ownership in upstate. So I think I'll maybe just end by saying, or echoing what Laura said, some things can only be done at the federal level. The whole question about legal status for undocumented immigrants is something that only the federal government can resolve. Future immigration is something only the federal government can address, but a lot can be done at the state level. And I think the way Laura said it is good. It's about immigrants and how do we invest in immigrants and help immigrants who are here to do better. That may also attract more people, both immigrants and non-immigrants, to upstate if we feel like there's a place where people are doing well. But it's about immigrants, and immigration may be a federal policy, but immigrant integration is something the state is front and center with. Oh, Scott, I think if you're talking now, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah, no, hi, you there? David, thank you so much. And again, I know you have questions for David. I'll ask that you hold them till the end. Our next speakers is Sarah Rogerson, and if you haven't read your newspaper recently, then I'll have to introduce her. Otherwise, you probably know of her. She's a professor at Albany Law School and directs the law school's immigration law clinic. Now, she has played a central role in providing representation and safeguarding rights of immigrants to the Capital Region community. And she's done this in some measure, and I don't want to overstate this, but law enforcement and immigration are, they're sometimes opposed terms, and I'm not quite certain that either merits that. I mean, but what Sarah did is she went to the law enforcement community and introduced them to immigrants in a way that I don't think anyone else could have. And as a consequence, they became or at least some of them became quite supportive of these immigrants into our community. And so I commend her for that. Sarah?
Thank you, Scott. A lot of work to do in terms of convincing our law enforcement colleagues, but we do have some shining examples of clear supporters and leaders now in that arena. For sure. And a lot of the hard work has to do with debunking these myths. And that's what I'm here to talk about today, are some of the prevailing, persistent, incessant, infectious myths that we have about immigrants and immigrant communities. And I'll try to take apart just a few of them. And I'm sorry I can't stay for the Q&A due to another obligation, because I always enjoy the back and forth. But I'm going to cover some of the big five and talk a little bit about what Albany Law School is doing in the community to support the most recent wave of Afghan refugees coming to the Capital District. So first, I want to echo thanks to one of my students, Matt Geeling, who is also a co-author on this chapter, and Camille Mackler, the executive director of the Immigrant Advocates Response Collaborative, where Matt has been getting a lot of on-the-ground training after taking the immigration law clinic at Albany Law School. The first myth that we tackle is the idea that immigrants are dangerous. This comes from a law and order rhetoric that began we say in our book chapter in the 1990s. It's been long before that, but really this intentional government-sponsored rhetoric around law and order as a response to migration, the process of people moving peacefully about the earth. And that's where we see manifested in the law the terms illegal alien. And we're working really hard to undo that ever since, right? The Biden administration committed to removing that language from the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is a great first step. But really, it's about us making a normative shift as a community to talk about people as people who are undocumented, people who don't have their paperwork. Some of us have been those people, even more recently in COVID times, trying to get across into the Canadian border. If you don't have all of the vaccination proof or the negative test that's required in some cases, you may be blocked as an American from entering Canada, which is something that we've been used to being able to do routinely. And so in that kind of, I try to reframe these issues for folks so that they see that illegal alien is just such a damaging term for so many reasons. There's also been increased militarization of the border that's happened quite rapidly since 9/11, truly with the formation of the Department of Homeland Security. My colleague, Jennifer Chacon in the Academy, has written extensively about the militarization of the border and the negative impact that that has had on our perception of immigrants. And, I think we worked very hard in the detention outreach project when we partnered with the Albany County Sheriff's Office to bring folks from the border who were being mistreated under the Trump administration and provide them with access to legal services and to show a better way forward. And that's why I'm excited to live and do this work in New York State, because we can do this as a country. We just need to show everyone the way and how to do it in a way that balances this need for law and order, and show that it's not a zero-sum game between migration and law and order. And in fact, there is documented in multiple places by multiple organizations, including those that are more conservatively focused. The Cato Institute in particular is one of my favorites to point to show that there is no link between migrants and a rising crime. And in fact, there is a direct correlation between an influx of migrants or refugees in a particular area and a decrease in levels of crime. So this idea that immigrants are dangerous is just, there are just so many different ways to attack it, and yet it still persists because of the language that is used to talk about each other, about our fellow global citizens. The second is that there is, the second myth to debunk is that there is a line for immigrants and it's easy to get into it. That is just 8 different ways from not true. There is not a direct line, and it's not as if people come and accumulate in a queue and then they're processed in an orderly fashion and in a timely way. There are cases that sit in immigration for contemplation for 6 to 10 years or more. And if you come from a country where we're not prioritizing migration, it could be decades before you get someone who was your child into the United States as an adult. It's just a complete myth that there is any kind of line to get into. And the idea of lines didn't exist when most people who are 2nd or 3rd generation Americans, which is most of us, when our ancestors arrived, there was no such thing as a line. That didn't exist. Immigration law as we know it today didn't exist. There are many branches of a patchwork of very limited options to obtain more permanent status in the United States, and refugee status is but one of them. And the Afghan refugees are going to fall into a number of those different buckets, none of which have a very clear pathway set in a reasonable amount of time to obtain a green card. So the third myth is that immigrants strain resources rather than contributing to general welfare. And here I want to be really careful about the conversation we're having today. And that is, it's tempting because we know that it's persuasive to say, to talk about individuals in terms of their economic contribution to society, right? But it's dangerous to do that because we're oversimplifying personhood, and we're carving away all the other beautiful things that people bring to the table when we join together as a community, right? This is not directed towards my co-panelists who do a brilliant job of this conversation. But I just want to lift up that we need to value people not just by their earning potential or by their economic contribution to the tax base, but also their contribution to arts and food and culture and community, and to just the general welfare, right? Our children also largely don't contribute to the tax base, and we value them nonetheless. And I don't want to infantilize immigrants, but like we have to keep thinking differently about our advocacy points for why refugees and immigrants are good for us generally, right? That being said, undocumented people also pay taxes. There's a way to do that. They can apply through the IRS, because I've spent actually many hours on hold with the IRS confirming that the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security do not communicate with one another. As long as the IRS is getting money, they don't, and it's from a bona fide source, they don't generally care what your status is in the country. And so there are easy ways for us to track this. Like, how do you track whether undocumented folks are paying taxes? Well, we can take a look at ITINs and we can deduce from a tax perspective how much of that income is going in. And if you look at page 10 of the book in our chapter, we break it down, and this was remarkable to me. Immigrants paid $647 million in taxes and had a spending power of $1.4 billion in the Capital District alone. Those are real numbers, 647 million in taxes and a spending power of 1.4 billion. That blows like COVID assistance out of the water from a federal government perspective, right? And that's just from people we like being closer to us. So, this idea that immigrants strain resources rather than contributing to the general welfare is just completely false. We talk about resources that need to be brought around people, just like any one of us is in a pinch at any point in our lives. We receive government assistance for all manner of things. Recent arrivals would be one of those pinch points for refugees. But beyond that, if we do it correctly, then we can really fold them in to everything that we're doing collectively. The fourth myth is that the United States no longer needs immigrants. Again, Shelly, I'm sure we'll talk about the Utica success story and how deeply we need them in all of our communities and how our communities have benefited from welcoming them in a substantive way. We have an aging workforce. We have stagnating participation in the workforce. There are so many reasons why we need immigrants. Again, it's an economic argument, but hey, if that's what persuades you, that's fine. That's what I'm here for. And then finally, the myth that we are a welcoming country. We keep saying like, this isn't who we are, the Statue of Liberty, it's a country of immigrants. It's not. Our laws are rooted in xenophobia and racist notions. One of the first immigration laws on the book was the Chinese Exclusion Act, not the We Love Immigrants Act, right? So, and that hasn't gotten better. It's only gotten worse. Like there are just more and more immigrants that we decide that we don't like. And so this idea that we're a welcoming country as a myth persists, and New York is doing a great job of saying that's not true, and this is how you welcome immigrants. And so again, that's why I love doing this work. I knew my time would go quickly, but one last note, another innovation, in terms of building capacity to actually welcome people in a real substantive way that will allow them to flourish in New York State involves funding legal services for refugee services. And so Albany Law School is helping the Albany office of the USCRI in terms of the hundreds of calls that they received after Afghanistan was evacuated. We're doing triage on intake. We're building models that are scalable in terms of pro bono representation. It's not enough. The folks are going to need legal assistance to make their way through this labyrinth of immigration laws in order to have a permanent home here. And if we really care about immigrants in New York State, then we really have to care about funding immigrant legal services. So thank you for the time. And Scott, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Shelly Callahan, and Shelly is the executive director of something that's now known as the Center, which is a great name, great brand. Formerly, it was known as the Mohawk Valley Resource Center for Refugees. Now, Shelly's role in resettling refugees in Utica and that remarkable city has recently been heralded in the documentary Utica, the Last Refuge, which I would commend to you. So Shelly, a point of personal prerogative, I guess. Among other things, could you address the question of what percentage of, and you don't have to do it at the beginning, of resettled refugees opt after a year or however long to go elsewhere? I mean, do they engage in outward migration, and to what extent? Okay, I do apologize for that. Thank you, Shelly.
Thank you, Scott. Nice to be with everybody today. Great to listen to the other speakers. I learned a lot. One of the things I love about this job is I get to continually learn about stuff that really interests me. I want to talk a little bit about the center and Utica sort of together. The center was started in 1979 by Roberta Douglas. She's our founding executive director. She started the agency in response to the Amerasian crisis that she saw happening on her television while she drank coffee at her kitchen table. And so the reason I always tell this story is because 40 some years later, 17,000 people have come through her center. This one woman had this incredible impact on certainly folks from all over the world, but also this community. So the Mohawk Valley Resource Center for Refugees was born, incorporated in 1981. And so refugees, SIVs, and now Afghan evacuees come through the doors here by the hundreds. Well, the center, what is now known as the center, was kind of growing and changing and welcoming different populations depending on what is happening around the globe. So refugee resettlement is very much kind of at the whim of whatever global crisis is happening at any time. In the 90s, we resettled about 5,000 Bosnians into our community. In the 2000s, we resettled lots of Burmese and Karen, but lots of other folks as well. And we continue to do that through the 2010s. And at this point, our diversity here in Utica has become very, very diverse. So, you know, Bosnians, Sudanese, Congolese, Karen, Burmese, Nepali, now Afghans, folks from the former Soviet Union. So we like to say in Utica, our diversity is very diverse. There's about 45 to 50 different languages spoken in our high school. So this is a city where over 25% of the community is now foreign-born. Over 30% of our community speaks a language other than English at home. And so Utica and the center have kind of come through this, journey together. And while the center's been doing all this, Utica in the 80s and 90s really suffered incredible economic and population decline. So a city that was built to hold about 110,000 dropped below 60,000 people in those decades. And really, there were parts of this city that did not look like a city in America. And in fact, a lot of the Bosnian refugees will tell you they couldn't believe when they got here that this was America. I have a colleague who was attacked by a pack of feral dogs in the city of Utica in the 1990s. There were lots of abandoned properties, lots of disrepair. It felt pretty hopeless. And there's not anybody here that wouldn't tell you, yeah, that was our reality. So while these refugees are coming and Utica's experiencing this decline, this, a strange synergy happens where they bring literally everything they have. And so when Sarah was talking about, you can't just judge it by economic, taxes and what they're earning, Utica is a clear example of that. Because they didn't show up with lots of money. What they showed up with was everything else that they had, their hopes, their potential, their children, their culture, their traditions, their food, and they poured it all into the city. And so over the last several decades, we have seen a rebirth at, like, as David said, the street level, Main Street level, businesses, houses that were renovated house by house, street by street as people moved in and put in sweat equity. And so Utica is this wonderful little story of, we put out a light and, hey, we're gonna offer you refuge, we're gonna save you. And in turn, they saved us right back. And so that story continues today. And I think that for me, one of the interesting things about the center, so people say, why Utica? What's unique about the center? I think one of the things that's unique about the center is that we're the only center in this city. Lots of other places have multiple agencies, and that changes the dynamic a little bit, not for better or worse, it's just different. So in Utica, everyone knows where the center is. Everyone knows how to find us for help. We have very close relationships with city government, the fire department, the police department, social services. Everybody knows who we are and that we're going to help them serve the community. We have so many different services here at the center, and that's purposeful. We talk about wraparound case management. We pick refugees up at the Syracuse airport. Typically, for whatever reason, a lot of flights get in at 11 o'clock at night. So we're driving people around to their new homes through the middle of the night, orienting them in their apartments till 1 or 2 in the morning, and then picking them up the next day and bringing them in for intense case management that lasts anywhere from 30 to 90 days. But what makes the center unique is that we have about, I would say, 15 different departments, everything from immigration and citizenship to professional language services. Our employment department literally puts hundreds of people in jobs every year, helps other people access training and opportunity. We have a traffic safety department that we put together in partnership with our local police department because they were struggling a little bit, helping people make sure that they were being safe in cars, on their bikes, while walking. And New York State started the Office for New Americans. So that really allowed us to expand our programs and reach out to immigrants as well. So we have what we consider a one-stop standalone agency. And what we've really done, when I really think about it, is we've been able to infuse a lot of the city with cultural competency and institutionalized kindness. I think, and I think that's one of the things that makes this city unique, but also the way that this agency operates. Our doors are open every day to anyone. We encourage the communities that we serve to make this place a part of themselves, to come in whenever they need anything. We want to stay connected to our communities. And so we've put together the programs that keep us relevant. We have put together, we just got funded by the CDC to do COVID work because they realized that we were the ones that probably had the tools to reach marginalized communities and make sure that they had access and opportunity to get information and vaccinations and things like that. So it's staying relative to the communities you serve, but also to the receiving community, to the community that we are. So our relationships with our community partners, I think, are probably pretty unique. When I talk to other executive directors at other agencies, you know, they don't know the mayor the way that I know the mayor here or the police chief. And I sit on the Mohawk Valley Regional Economic Development Council, and that's something that David mentioned. This agency is really recognized as a cornerstone institution, an economic pillar of this community. There are folks in power here, from the mayor to the county executive to other electeds, that understand what refugees and immigrants bring. And so they support this center, they support our mission, and they're present. If I need something, I can make a phone call, and they really do help us out. So I think that all of that kind of wrapped up together is a little bit of what makes the center and Utica unique. We are not perfect by any means, and there are, I think, 14 other resettlement centers across New York State. In Syracuse and Rochester and Albany and Buffalo, the upstate places, they do refugee resettlement. In most places, there is more than one resettlement agency. So maybe only one resettlement agency there will hold the Office for New American grant or something like that. So I think things are a little bit different as to how the community accesses services. But by and large, I do think that we all you know, do a lot of things the same way. Case management can look the same way in a lot of different places. I do think the way that we are so intentional about wraparound services does make us a little unique. We really, really pride ourselves on the fact that people want to come in here. We have on-site adult ESL classes that go full day here. We partner with our community college. They give us the instructors. We just got DRI funding, so downtown development dollars from the state to upgrade our whole workforce development suite. So we'll be doing that early next year. That is really going to help us meet the demands of employers, which frankly, we can't keep up with right now. And as far as out-migration, Scott, you asked about out-migration. We don't really have the numbers on that. We can kind of guess, but refugees can move wherever they want to move in the country once they get here. So they don't always let us know, and they might go someplace and not access a resettlement site there. I can tell you that our in-migration numbers are really high. Probably, you know, in any given year, we might resettle 400 to 500 people. And there's easily another 100 to 200 that come in from other parts of the country. And I would just close by saying right now we are in the midst of doing Afghan evacuee resettlement. And so, you know, the 4 years of the previous administration were pretty tough for refugee resettlement agencies. There were lots of cuts, our programs shrunk. Last year in total, we only resettled 58 people, which was a historic low. It wasn't even that low, not even close after 9/11. So we've hit some hard times. In the last 6 weeks, we have resettled over 70 Afghan evacuees and additional refugees. So things have really picked up again, and we're very happy to be doing this work. The folks that we're working with are going to be a wonderful part of the community here, and we're excited to do this work. But it's definitely a little challenging to go from 0 to 120 in a very short span of time. But that's what we're doing here in Utica. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Shelly, thank you so much, but I'm not going to let you off the hook that quickly. And I would invite anyone to comment on this. There's a perception that, and maybe it's the reality, that in smaller communities and smaller cities, you have long-term residents and they're struggling. And their first reaction to a new community that parachutes in is suspicion, bordering sometimes on antagonism. And it's certainly understandable. How have you bridged the gap, and have you bridged the gap? Have any of you seen instances where, as I suggested before, that proximity defeats intolerance? So, Shelly, I'll put that to you, but certainly anyone can answer.
Yeah, I do think one of the things that's interesting about doing resettlement in a smaller city is, so there is one large high school in Utica. There's a couple of charter schools that have started in the past couple of years, but by and large, there's one large high school with about 3,000 students. So everybody's kids end up kind of going to that high school. Or if you go to a Walmart or any of the supermarkets around here, the city isn't big enough to have these sort of enclaves of just, Karen or just Arabic speaking folks. There's this, you have to get to know each other, because you're all going to be together at different points. And I think sometimes in bigger cities, communities can really kind of have their own markets, their own churches, their kind of own everything, and be a little more isolated if they choose to be. I think it's harder to do in smaller places. And I do think that, the more you really get to know each other, the more your kids make friends with the kids from Sudan or, Burma, the harder it is for you to maybe have inhospitable thoughts. I think there is that. Not to say that this is perfect. There are occasionally some cranks who speak up and say things, but Utica has never, ever had sort of a gathering of folks who stand up and say, we don't want refugees, or, we don't want more immigrants. And maybe it has to do with the long history of immigrants that come to this city, back to the 1900s, kind of building this place up. But we've been really fortunate with that. I do think that when you're welcoming folks into your community, you have to talk to community members. You have to make sure that you're letting medical service providers know that you might be bringing, 100 refugees in from wherever, and this is going to be their language. This is some of the concerns and cultural things, and we really make sure that we do that. As much as we know, we share and inform our community and really bring them in as partners. So that's what I got.
You. Okay, now to now to David and Laura. This is the harder question, I think. Well, perhaps not. I don't want to sugarcoat this. This is we've done a lot of things right in New York State, and we are a laboratory for social change here with respect to immigrants and so many other things. But I sense from what you've said that there's so much more to do. And I've heard from David and others, we need a strategy, either an upstate strategy or a statewide strategy, both to address the humanity of it all and also the economics. And I'm wondering if David and Laura, if you could just sort of, maybe we'll begin with David and then we'll work up the screen. just talk about what a statewide strategy would look like?
Well, I think first of all, you can say why statewide, and I think especially for upstate, it's where the money is, right? I mean, I think it would be great to have a federal policy. I don't think that's in the offing anytime very soon. I think New York State has a tremendous history of supporting immigration and immigrant integration, and I think there's a lot that we could do here. I think any kind of statewide strategy has to start with a recognition of the really big differences between the different regions of the state. And so I think it would make a lot of sense to have an upstate strategy within, kind of embedded within a larger statewide approach. And I mean, I mentioned some of the kinds of things. I would say start with, maybe I can sort of build on what Shelly was saying. Like, I think there are within our communities and within the country, I think on the one hand, of course, we've over different periods of times seen different levels of intensity, a lot of anti-immigrant backlash and racist backlash against people coming from different places or different cultures. On the other hand, there's also at the same time an incredible welcoming spirit within America. And I think communities that are in fact eager to try to say, how do we recognize our own history as immigrants? Basically, almost all of us who weren't brought over as slaves or or lived here as Native Americans came as immigrants in our families at some point, and we're kind of proud of that history. And also, I think just are very welcoming to people in a way that is not always true in every part of the world. It's a special American thing in some ways, I think. So, how do you engage that? Part of it is, I think, not having people competing for resources. So, for example, having really decent funding of schools everywhere, having really decent public transportation everywhere, is the kind of thing that helps people to feel more generous because they're not so worried about what's going to happen to my kids. And then I think having some intermediaries, like, I think the refugee resettlement agencies are great for refugees, and in some places, like the center, kind of foremost, actually really a standout in the country, thinking beyond just refugees to also, broader communities. But like, there need to be other institutions, and there are other institutions that help to step in and make sure that we're weaving the communities together in different ways. And I think we can support that a lot more. So, I mean, I think there's all kinds of stuff that we can do if we really make it a top priority.
Oh, okay. Now, Laura, I'm going to ask you a question, which is a little more conceptual, I guess. We've heard how it works in Utica, and we know it worked well in Buffalo and Syracuse, Rochester. That is to say, well, in terms of the contribution and the community's response. But 250 miles away, which is really the same time zone, in Washington, inside the Beltway, representatives of these same communities tell a different story. They beat their drum for weaponizing immigration and talking to, it's the us and them, while their communities, their constituents, left to their own devices, have figured it out. And how would you say, what is the methodology? How do we tell the story inside Washington so people understand better that Washington should not define the issue? The issue should be defined by our community experiences. Sorry if that was prolix. Go ahead, please.
Am I off mute?
You're just fine. I'm no one to criticize, apparently, according to David.
This mute thing the whole morning. But I was just going to say that definitely is a tough question to answer, and it is more of the academic side. So you're right with the conceptual end. But if I was able to tell you, I think I'd win the lottery. I would solve the problems of the immigration policy because we'd have how to handle the political discourse. But bringing it back to that evaluation of our role. And like I said, that's one of the efforts that the network of offices for New Americans are trying to bring out, and sharing. And that's why New York, having been part of that network and that communication, is to bring it back to raise the importance of what we're doing for the stability of our community. That being said, I think the points that Shelly and David both make are also very important, is kind of addressing the fear of the unknown. The best way often is to empower ourselves, in our community, as to not be afraid of that immigrant. And I think that's one of the things, is not when you have interactions, and it's been my personal experience. I am from the south of Mexico myself. And one of the things that I have first faced was, people looking at me different, saying, well, you're really Mexican? Just those questions, you start breaking, we start getting along, we start relating, they start seeing you, that you're not that person to be afraid of, that you're not going to take their employment away, that you're going to build and contribute to the community. So I think emphasizing on that, and that's what New York State has been doing, an example with other states and setting that up, but bringing it to DC as well in that way. However, as I said, I think it takes a lot of strength. The last time an comprehensive immigration reform took place was 1986. And there was a lot of work behind it, a lot of advocacy behind it. It's still hard to find out how exactly, but when I do, I would really want to have the lottery one. I know it's a hard one to answer.
No, you did. You did quite well. Hang on, unmute.
No, you're fine. Don't do anything.
What?
You're good.
I'm good. All right. Well, that, folks, is it. Let's see. I see some notes from David. I see no other notes. So if I may, let me conclude, if I may, again, it's taking the prerogative here. I guess first I want to thank Laura, David, Sarah, and Shelley, and also the Rockefeller Institute, not only for their participation today, but really to their contributions. They were quite busy, and yet they made the time to write really sobering articles for the book, and I do appreciate that. But one final thought. Upstate, at least to my way of thinking, and certainly that this is the import of the book, has proven one immutable fact. And that's when those of different backgrounds and ethnicities and faiths are given the opportunity to know one another, respect and positive energy is typically the product. And so I guess what I've learned is that intolerance will struggle to take root in such an environment. I have so enjoyed this, and I hope you have as well. Thanks very, very much.